Imagine absolute darkness. Not the soft, velvety darkness of a southern night where you can make out the silhouettes of trees against a starry sky. No. This was a primal, thick, almost tangible darkness inside a concrete tomb, buried under tons of twisted metal and earth. This was the darkness of a sealed space, where the air itself had become as thick and heavy as swamp water. The third day, December 4th, 1943. Coastal Bunker Number 7, Port of Bari, Italy. In this hellish gloom, a ragged, rasping breath can barely be heard. It belongs to Private First Class Leo Miller. He is only 19 years old and he is dying. His lungs burn with fire. Every breath is an agony, as if he were inhaling not air, but crushed glass soaked in acid. His eyes have long seen nothing, his eyelids swollen and sealed shut by the caustic fluid that has wept from them for the last 2 days. But even if he could open them, he would see nothing. The single light bulb overhead had shattered on the first day. Now, his world is one of smells and sounds. The smell of damp concrete, stale sweat, fear, and something else. Something sickly sweet, with the distinct note of rotting garlic or bitter almonds. This smell has seeped into his skin, his hair, his own breath. It has become a part of him. And the sounds were even worse. Faint moans that faded one by one into silence. Gurgling death rattles, cut short with chilling finality. Sometimes, a low, mad whisper, murmuring names no one will ever hear again. Around him in the dark lie bodies, the bodies of his comrades. Sergeant Davis, Corporal Rossi, Private Jenkins. There were 12 of them in total. Now he doesn't know how many are left. Perhaps he is alone. His right hand desperately clutches the stub of a chemical pencil. With his left, he fumbles for a scrap of paper, a page torn from his field medic's guide. He doesn't know why he's doing it. No one will ever read these lines. But his hand, trembling and covered in blisters, scrawls uneven, blind letters onto the paper. This isn't smoke. It's... The pencil snaps. Miller lets out a quiet, whimpering sound and drops the fragments to the concrete floor. Helplessness. That is what he feels. Not the fear of death. He has grown almost used to that. But the monstrous helplessness of a medic who had made a correct diagnosis but had no means to treat it. He knew what was killing them. He had known since the first day. But his knowledge was useless in this mass grave. The air in his lungs is running out. He tries to take another breath, but a pain so sharp lances through his chest that what streams from beneath his swollen eyelids are not tears, but a thick, yellow mucus. He is alone, trapped, buried alive in the company of dead men killed by an enemy none of them ever saw. How did they, a group of young soldiers full of life, end up in this hell on earth? How did their hope for rescue turn into a slow, agonizing demise over 72 hours? To understand how a squad of American infantrymen, survivors of a bombing inferno, became the silent inhabitants of a concrete crypt, we must go back 3 days. To that clear, cold December day when their world did not yet smell of garlic and death. To the day they still believed they would survive this war. December 2nd, 1943, was a day of deceptive calm. The Italian sun, low and cold, bathed the port of Bari in a pale watercolor light. The air was crisp and salty, smelling of wet pebbles, fish, and cheap tobacco. For the soldiers of the American Expeditionary Force, it was just another endless day of waiting and routine. The war here, in southern Italy, seemed to have stalled, bogged down in mud and the indecision of high command. The soldiers unloading the ships did so lazily, with the weary resignation that comes after many months of a campaign. Among them was Sergeant Michael Davis, a man of 35, with a face weathered by wind and sun, and eyes the color of a faded field uniform. He was a career soldier, one of those who considered the army his only true home. Davis had no time for sentiment or idle chatter. His world was made of orders, discipline, and responsibility for his men. He now stood on the pier, watching his squad haul crates of ammunition from the transport ship John L. Motley. Nearby, leaning against a stack of crates, sat 19-year-old Private Billy Jenkins, scribbling furiously in a notepad. He was writing a letter to his mother, his fourth that week. Billy was the youngest in the squad, a skinny kid from Ohio with freckles on his nose and a perpetual, slightly bewildered smile. He still saw the war as a great, terrifying, but thrilling adventure he would one day tell his grandchildren about. "Writing to your ma again, Jenkins?" Davis asked without turning. His voice was hoarse, raspy from smoke. "Yes, Sergeant. Telling her it's almost like a resort here. Sun, sea, just missing the palm trees." Davis grunted. "Just make sure you don't tell her it's not only fish swimming in that sea, and that sometimes the sun falls out of the sky and explodes." A short distance away, Corporal Vincent Rossi, an Italian-American from Brooklyn, was loudly arguing with an Italian dock worker, gesticulating as if conducting an orchestra. Rossi was loud, cocky, and perpetually dissatisfied. He hated Italy, he hated the army food, he hated the officers, but he loved to argue and prove he was right. And a little further off, in the shadow of a crane, sat Private Leo Miller, the very medic who, in 3 days, would be left almost entirely alone. He wasn't part of the unloading detail. He sat with his legs crossed, reading. In his hands was a thick, worn book, the Manual of Military Toxicology. To others, it was just a boring manual. To Miller, it was a world unto itself. He was a quiet, introverted young man who had joined the army as a medic not for glory, but out of a sincere desire to help. He was not a soldier, but a doctor in uniform, and the crude violence of war was alien to him. His war was against infection, wounds, and disease. "Hey, Doc!" Rossi yelled to him, breaking off his argument. "Quit reading about your poisons. Come give us a hand with this junk. Those books won't build your muscles." Miller raised his serious eyes from behind his glasses, said nothing, and went back to his book. He was reading a chapter on the effects of vesicant, or blistering, agents. Specifically, mustard gas. It described a characteristic odor, resembling garlic or mustard, a latent period before symptoms appeared, and the horrific consequences for the respiratory system and skin. He read it with purely academic interest, like a student preparing for an exam. He did not yet know that in a few hours, he would be forced to take that exam for real, and the price of failure would be human lives. Evening fell. The western sky was painted in soft, pink-orange hues. A few searchlights flickered on in the port. The soldiers finished their work, and now sat on the pier, smoking and talking quietly. They spoke of home, of girls, of what would happen after the war. Jenkins proudly showed everyone a photo of his sister. Rossi spun tall tales of his adventures in Naples. Davis stared silently at the dark water, which reflected the lights of the ships. The harbor was packed as tight as a can of sardines. Dozens of vessels, military and merchant, waited to be unloaded. Among them, one stood out, a Liberty ship named the John Harvey. It was moored slightly apart, and there was a particular tense bustle of activity around it. None of Davis's squad knew that it carried a secret cargo, 2,000 M47A1 bombs, each containing 60 pounds of mustard gas. This shipment was Roosevelt's answer in case Germany decided to use chemical weapons in Italy. Only a handful of high-ranking officers knew of its existence. To the hundreds of soldiers in the port, it was just another ship. The last peaceful evening of their lives was drawing to a close. Miller closed his book and tucked it into his duffel bag. Jenkins carefully folded his unfinished letter. Davis finished his cigarette and flicked the butt into the water. At 19:30 hours, a rising drone came from the sea. At first it was faint, barely audible, then grew louder and louder, swelling into the low, menacing roar of dozens of aircraft engines. Someone shouted, "Air raid!" The next second, the silence of the December evening was shattered by the piercing, blood-curdling wail of an air raid siren. At that moment, none of them understood that this wasn't just another raid. It was the skeletal hand of fate, knocking on the steel door of their future, a future that for most of them was destined to end in a damp concrete crypt on the shore of the Adriatic Sea. Chaos descended on the port of Bari with the fury of a biblical cataclysm. The sky, peaceful and dark just a moment before, suddenly blossomed with dozens of blinding flashes as anti-aircraft batteries came to life, desperately and almost uselessly spitting tracer rounds into the darkness. And then death began to rain from above. The first bomb struck the mole, throwing up gigantic columns of water, concrete dust, and twisted metal. The deafening roar of explosions merged into a single, continuous thunder that seemed to make the very ground vibrate. The soldiers, who had been peacefully smoking on the pier a moment ago, scattered like a disturbed anthill. The screams of the wounded, the shouts of officers, the crackle of fires, it all blended into a monstrous cacophony of destruction. "To cover! The bunker! Move!" Sergeant Davis's voice cut through the roar of a falling bomb. He wasn't yelling, he was bellowing. And in that roar was the steel-like certainty that makes men obey instinctively. He grabbed the horror-frozen Jenkins by the collar and literally dragged him toward the coastal fortifications. Miller, Rossi, and the others ran after him, ducking low to the ground, stumbling over bodies and debris. The air filled with the acrid smell of cordite and burning fuel oil. Somewhere nearby, an ammunition depot exploded, and a fiery mushroom cloud rose into the sky, momentarily illuminating an apocalyptic scene. Burning ships, collapsing port structures, tiny figures of people running in panic. Their destination was a small concrete pillbox built into the base of the mole, Bunker Number 7. Its thick walls and steel doors seemed the only island of safety in this ocean of fire. One by one, they tumbled inside, gasping for breath from the run and the fear. Davis was the last one in. He threw his full weight against the massive door and slid the heavy steel bolt home with a clang. And at that exact moment, an explosion of monstrous force erupted outside. The bunker shuddered as if struck by a giant hammer. Dust and small stones rained down from the ceiling. The single light bulb overhead flickered and died, plunging them into absolute darkness. A deafening, ringing silence fell, broken only by their own heavy breathing. The John Harvey had exploded. A direct hit from an aerial bomb had detonated its cargo, but it wasn't the mustard gas bombs that had detonated. It was the conventional high-explosive munitions stored in the adjacent holds. Thousands of tons of liquid mustard agent were simply atomized into the air, mixing with the thick, black smoke from fuel and oil burning on the water. A toxic cloud began to creep slowly over the harbor, enveloping everything in its path. But the soldiers in Bunker Number 7 didn't know this. To them, that explosion was just the loudest in a long series. Someone in the dark flicked a lighter. The dim flame snatched their faces from the gloom, pale, covered in sweat and grime, their eyes wide with terror. 12 men, all from Davis's squad, all alive. Rossi was the first to break the silence. He laughed nervously. "What a fireworks show. Looks like we were born lucky, boys." Others joined his laughter. The tension that had gripped them began to recede, replaced by the euphoria of survival. They had made it. They were in the right place at the right time. They had cheated death. Jenkins, still trembling, sat on the floor and hugged his knees. Miller took a long drink of water from his canteen. Davis went to the door and tried to slide the bolt back. It wouldn't budge. "Blocked," he said flatly. "The door's jammed with debris." The news brought silence for a few seconds, but then Rossi waved his hand dismissively. "It's nothing. They'll clear the rubble by morning. The main thing is we're alive. We've got water, emergency rations. We'll ride it out in here like it's a hotel." And they believed him. They wanted to believe him. They sat in the dark, listening as the cannonade outside faded, and rejoiced in their miraculous escape. They didn't yet know that their prison wasn't the concrete walls. Their prison became the very air they breathed, and that their most terrible enemy was already seeping in, unseen, silently. through the ventilation shafts, through the cracks in the steel door. A strange, oily smoke began to filter into the bunker. It wasn't like normal smoke from a fire. It was denser and had a faint but distinct odor, a smell that Miller had encountered somewhere before, or rather, had read about. A smell like garlic. The first few hours in the concrete cocoon were spent in a state of nervous excitement. The soldiers told war stories, shared impressions of the horror they'd just endured, and guessed when they would be dug out. The euphoria of survival drowned out the fear and claustrophobia. They were together, they were alive, and everything else seemed like a temporary hardship. Sergeant Davis, the only one who hadn't succumbed to the general cheer, did a sweep of their small shelter with a flashlight. The bunker was small, roughly 4 by 5 meters, about 13 by 16 feet, with a low ceiling. Wooden benches lined the walls. In one corner sat a barrel of emergency water and a crate of K rations. The ventilation was primitive. 2 narrow shafts near the ceiling that led outside. It was through these that the strange smoke was seeping in. It wasn't thick, more like a light, barely visible haze that gave the flashlight beam substance. And that smell, it was growing more distinct. What's that stink? Rossi grimaced. Burning rubber probably, or some chemicals from the ships, someone guessed. Smells like my grandmother's kitchen when she's making pesto, Rossi chuckled. Except the garlic's gone bad. Miller was silent. He sniffed the air, and a vague, cold unease grew inside him. Over and over he replayed the pages from his manual in his mind. The smell of garlic, mustard, or horseradish. That's how they described the smell of mustard gas in field conditions. But he pushed the thought away. A chemical attack? Here? In Italy? Impossible. The Germans hadn't used gas since the First World War. It was an unwritten rule of this war. It was probably just some port chemicals burning. By midnight, the bombing had stopped completely. Outside, a silence descended, broken only by the distant crackle of dying fires. The soldiers, exhausted by the ordeal, began to fall asleep on the benches and the floor. Davis set up a watch at the door, 1 hour each, so they wouldn't miss the rescuers. The first alarming symptoms appeared towards morning. Jenkins woke up. He complained that his eyes were stinging terribly, as if someone had thrown sand in them. Half an hour later, 2 more men woke up with the same complaint. Davis chalked it up to the smoke and dust. Rinse your eyes with water and try to get some sleep. They'll have us out by morning. But morning brought no rescue. No one came. Not a sound could be heard from outside. No voices, no machinery. Just a dead silence. And that was more terrifying than the roar of the bombs. Panic began to seep into their shelter as inexorably as the poisonous smoke. By noon, everyone's eyes were hurting. They rubbed them, but that only made it worse. Their eyelids began to swell. A dry, hacking cough appeared. First one man, then another. By evening, everyone was coughing. "What is this crap?" Rossi croaked, his voice unusually quiet. "We're gonna suffocate in here." Davis tried to remain calm. He established a strict routine. He personally rationed the water, 1 canteen cap every 2 hours. He forbade smoking to conserve oxygen. He forbade loud talking. His short, sharp commands were the only thing keeping the group from total chaos. He became their dictator, their jailer, and his iron will was their only salvation. Miller didn't sleep. He sat in a corner listening to his comrades' coughs, analyzing the symptoms. Stinging eyes turning into conjunctivitis, a dry cough gradually becoming wet, a sore throat, hoarseness, and all of it against the backdrop of a persistent garlic smell. The picture was forming in his mind, and it was monstrous. He went to Davis. "Sergeant, I think this isn't just smoke." Davis gave him a hard look. "What is it then, Miller? Perfume from Mademoiselle?" "I think it's a chemical agent, possibly mustard gas or something similar. It all fits. The smell, the effect on the eyes, the respiratory tract, the latent period." Davis listened in silence for a few seconds. Then he said hollowly, "You're crazy, son. What the hell do you mean, mustard gas? You've read too many of your books. It's smoke from burning fuel. We just breathed in a lot of soot. We'll air out and be fine." "But Sergeant—" "I said that's enough!" Davis cut him off. "Don't you dare start a panic. The men are scared enough without your fantasies. You're the medic, so do your job. Hand out some aspirin or whatever you've got." Miller backed away. They didn't believe him. His knowledge, his only weapon, was useless against a wall of soldierly pragmatism and disbelief. He was alone with his terrible suspicion. He returned to his corner and opened his medical bag. Aspirin, bandages, iodine. All useless against an enemy that had already entered their blood, their lungs. Just then, he heard a new sound. It was Jenkins's cough, but it had changed. It was deep, a wet rattle, as if the boy were trying to cough up his own lungs. The coughing fit ended, and in the silence that followed they heard a quiet, wet sound. Miller shone his flashlight on Jenkins. On the boy's lips, mixing with his saliva, pink foam was bubbling. He was coughing up blood. The moment the flashlight beam snatched Jenkins's bloodied lips from the darkness, the fragile world Sergeant Davis had tried to hold together with his iron will collapsed. Panic, which had been smoldering beneath the surface of discipline, erupted with new force. Someone screamed. Someone started swearing, their voice cracking into a shriek. Rossi jumped to his feet. "He's dying! This crap is going to kill us all. We have to get out of here." He lunged at the door and began pounding on it with his fists, screaming incoherent curses. Davis crossed the bunker in 2 strides, grabbed Rossi by the shoulder, and spun him around. "Shut your mouth! Sit down," he roared. But Rossi was beyond listening. His eyes were wild with terror. "We're gonna die in here like rats in a trap. I don't want to die." He swung at the sergeant. Davis didn't flinch. He just hit Rossi. A short, hard punch to the jaw. The corporal crumpled to the floor. Silence fell over the bunker again, broken only by Jenkins's gurgling cough and Davis's heavy breathing. Everyone stared at the sergeant. In that moment, he was no longer just their commander. He had become the embodiment of power. Brutal, but necessary. Meanwhile, Miller was already at Jenkins's side. He tried to help the boy sit up, propping a duffel bag behind his back. But he knew it was like putting a bandage on a corpse. Jenkins's lungs were scorched. Edema had set in. This was the end. "Sergeant," Miller said quietly without turning around, "do you believe me now?" Davis walked over and looked at the dying soldier. There was no more skepticism in his gaze, only a hollow, bottomless despair. "What can we do, Doc?" he asked, just as quietly. And that question contained everything. The admission that he was wrong, the desperation, and the last, faint hope for a miracle. For the knowledge of this quiet kid in glasses whom everyone had dismissed as a bookworm. And Miller, the young medic who just yesterday had been reading about this in a textbook, suddenly felt the weight of 11 lives settle on his shoulders. His own fear receded. The cold, analytical mind of a doctor took over. "Mustard gas is an oily liquid," he began, his voice fast and sharp as if giving a lecture. "It penetrates not just through the lungs, but through the skin, especially moist areas. We're all soaked in it. The smoke we were breathing was an aerosol. It settled on our clothes, our skin, our hair, and it's still poisoning us." He shone his flashlight on the water barrel. A thin, iridescent film floated on the surface. "The water's contaminated too. We drank it. We washed with it. We only made things worse." A deathly silence hung in the bunker. Each man grasped the monstrous truth. They themselves, with their own hands, had worsened their condition. Their shelter, their salvation, had turned out to be a slow-motion gas chamber. "What do we do?" Davis repeated. "First, no water from that barrel. Not a drop," Miller commanded. His voice had found a new firmness. He was in charge now. Who has any water left in their canteens? Only 3 hands went up. That's our strategic reserve. For drinking only. 2 sips a day. Second, we have to try to decontaminate our skin, stripped to the waist. Obeying his new authority, the soldiers reluctantly began to pull off their field jackets. Miller shone the flashlight. In their armpits, groins, and on their necks, red patches were already beginning to appear, the harbingers of horrific blisters. We need rags. Tear your undershirts into strips, the cleanest ones. A few minutes later, he had a small supply of clean cloth. He distributed it to the men. Dampen the cloth with a little water from your canteen. Just a little. And gently, without rubbing, wipe your skin. Neck, armpits, groin, 1 rag per man. Then put them in the far corner. It was a desperate, almost futile measure. Most of the poison had already been absorbed, but it was something. It was their first deliberate battle against the invisible enemy, their first small victory, snatched from the jaws of despair. They had conquered panic. They had created a system. They had armed themselves with knowledge. They felt a fragile, fleeting hope. While they were engaged in this grim procedure, Jenkins's coughing stopped. Miller went over to him. The boy lay with his eyes open, seeing nothing. He was dead. Hope died with him. And in that moment, Rossi, who had been sitting with his head in his hands, looked up at Miller. There was no madness in his eyes. There was only a cold, rational hatred. "You're lying, Doc," he hissed. "You just want all the water for yourself. There's no gas. It's just some infection. And you're killing us with your panic." And Miller realized his war had only just begun, and that the most dangerous enemy was not outside, but right here, inside the hearts of men broken by terror. The death of Private Jenkins was the point of no return. It divided their time in the bunker into before and after. Before, they were soldiers caught in a trap. Now they were patients in a makeshift infirmary, waiting for their turn to die. The atmosphere in the concrete crypt changed. It grew thick, viscous with fear and despair. The euphoria of the first hours gave way to a grim, silent waiting game. Sergeant Davis, realizing the full depth of the catastrophe, completely ceded medical authority to Miller, retaining responsibility only for maintaining discipline. The bunker was divided into 3 zones, just like a real hospital. In one corner, which they designated the clean zone, were those with the mildest symptoms. In the center were the severe cases, those who were coughing badly and showing the first signs of skin lesions. And the far corner, where Jenkins's body lay covered by a greatcoat, became the morgue. Life became a harsh, monotonous ritual. Every 3 hours, Miller made his rounds. He examined each man's skin, listened to their breathing, asked questions. His flashlight, like a surgeon's scalpel, cut patches of reddened skin, swollen eyes, and cracked lips out of the darkness. Then Davis would distribute the water, 1 canteen cap each. This procedure became sacred. Everyone watched each other to make sure no one took a sip more than their share. They spent the rest of the time in silence. Talking was difficult because of the pain in their throats. And besides, there was nothing left to say. Each man retreated into his own private hell. They remembered home, their civilian lives. These memories were both a salvation and the most terrible form of torture. The contrast between a sunny day on a farm in Kansas and this cold, stinking darkness was unbearable. But the system Miller and Davis had created gave them more than just a chance at survival. It gave them purpose, the daily routine, the clear rules, the division of labor. One man was in charge of keeping quiet, another handled a makeshift cleanup. It all created the illusion of control. They weren't just passively waiting to die. They were fighting back. Their small, dying empire resisted the chaos. However, not everyone was willing to live by the laws of this new, terrible world. Corporal Rossi became the center of opposition. His initial shock gave way to aggressive denial. He obeyed orders, but with a defiant air. He had stopped believing Miller. To him, the young medic was not a savior, but a mad usurper whose theories about gas had driven them all to paranoia. "He's just a kid who's read too many scary stories," he would whisper to the man on the bench next to him. "And we're listening to him like he's a prophet. Jenkins had pneumonia, that's all. And we're going crazy in here from fear and this stench." By the evening of the second day, large, painful blisters had appeared on Rossi's own neck and in his groin. The skin beneath them was crimson and inflamed. This should have convinced him that Miller was right, but it had the opposite effect. The pain and fear finally shattered his reason. He decided it was some contagious skin disease that Miller was hiding, or maybe was even the source of. He saw that the medic's symptoms were less severe than the others, and this struck him as suspicious. His paranoia found a receptive audience in two other soldiers who were on the verge of a nervous breakdown. In the darkness of the bunker, a conspiracy began to fester. They decided that Miller and Davis were hiding a real canteen of clean water from them, and were giving them poisoned water to prolong their suffering. They decided to take power into their own hands. Their plan was simple: wait for Davis to fall asleep, then forcibly take Miller's medical bag and the canteens of water. They believed it was their only chance for salvation. Miller felt the tension. He saw the way Rossi looked at him, saw them whispering in the corner. He warned Davis, but the sergeant just waved it off. "I can handle them," the sergeant rasped. His own cough was getting worse. He was a strong man, but the invisible enemy was sapping his strength just like everyone else's. Their orderly, predictable life was hanging by a thread. They had overcome panic, created a system, but they had failed to account for the greatest enemy of all: human desperation, which was more terrifying than any poison. Inside this concrete box, cut off from the entire world, a mutiny was brewing, a rebellion of the damned against those who were trying to save them. The conflict erupted in the pre-dawn hours of the third day, when exhaustion and despair had reached their peak. Davis, tormented by a relentless cough, had dozed off while sitting by the door. Miller was checking on the most critical of the remaining soldiers when he sensed movement behind him. He spun around. In the weak beam of his flashlight, its batteries already dying, he saw three shadows detach themselves from the wall. Rossi was in the lead. His face was a mask of pain and fury, his eyes glittering feverishly. One of the blisters on his neck had burst, and a cloudy yellow fluid was trickling down his skin. "Give up the water, Doc," he hissed, "and your bag. We know you're poisoning us, a little at a time." The other two soldiers stood behind him, clutching pieces of rebar. Miller slowly straightened up. He felt no fear, only an icy calm and a kind of bitter exhaustion. "Rossi, don't be a fool. You can see what's happening to you. This isn't an infection. It's what I've been telling you." "Liar!" Rossi screamed. "You want us all to die so you can walk out of here alive! Give me the water!" He took a step forward. At that moment, a scraping sound came from behind them. It was Davis, fighting through his weakness, getting to his feet. He leaned his back against the wall to keep from falling. "Stand down," he rasped. His voice was barely audible, but it had its customary steel. "Corporal, return to your position. That's an order." "To hell with your orders, Sergeant," Rossi shot back. "There are no more orders in here. It's every man for himself." He turned to his accomplices. "Get him." But they hesitated. The figure of the sergeant, even weakened and sick, still inspired their habitual awe. Davis knew he couldn't overpower them physically. Any sudden movement could trigger a suffocating coughing fit. He had only one weapon left: his words. He employed what might later be called surgical cruelty. He didn't try to persuade or threaten them. He looked Rossi directly in the eyes and said coldly and clearly, "Fine, Corporal. Take the water, drink it all. It'll last you a day, maybe two, and then you'll start dying of thirst. But even before that, you'll start to rot alive from this stuff because the only man in here who knows how to even slow it down is him." Davis nodded toward Miller. "You'll kill him, you'll kill me, and then you'll turn on each other for the last drop of water. and you will die here in the dark, in your own filth. Is that what you want, Rossi? Is that your plan for survival? His words, delivered without a shred of emotion, hit harder than any punch. They painted a picture for the mutineers of their future. A short, ugly, and utterly hopeless one. One of the soldiers behind Rossi lowered his rebar. The other muttered something and retreated into the shadows. Rossi was left alone. His rage was spent, replaced by a total, crushing despair. He looked at his hands, at the blisters swelling under his skin, and suddenly he began to sob, loudly like a child, unashamed of his tears. He fell to his knees and beat his head against the concrete floor until Davis came over and laid a hand on his shoulder. The mutiny was crushed, not by force but by the terrible, merciless truth. The enemy within had been defeated. The group was whole again, cemented by shared grief and a common fate. But while they fought amongst themselves, their true invisible enemy had continued its work. In the ensuing silence, broken only by Rossi's sobs, they heard a low, drawn-out moan. It came from the corner where the critical patient Miller had been examining was lying. The moan turned into a death rattle and then stopped. Miller went to him, shone his flashlight. Private Pete O'Malley, a 40-year-old veteran who'd been through the first battles in Africa, was dead. His face was frozen in a mask of agony. He was the second to go. And everyone in the bunker understood that this was only the beginning. Their victory over themselves proved to be a Pyrrhic one. They had defended their fragile order. But the price of that victory was time. Time that their invisible executioner had mercilessly ticked away. The death of O'Malley, the quiet and level-headed veteran many of them had looked up to, was the final blow. If a tough, seasoned soldier like him couldn't make it, what chance did they have? The hope that had flickered in their souls after the mutiny was quashed, finally extinguished, replaced by a dull, animalistic submission to fate. The bunker had become a true hell. The air was heavy, saturated with the fumes of the poison and the stench of sickness and death. By the middle of the third day, almost no one could stand. Their bodies were covered in enormous, fluid-filled blisters that burst at the slightest movement, leaving behind weeping, painful sores. The coughing tore at their lungs. Every breath sent a searing pain through their chests. They lay on the cold concrete slabs like fish thrown onto the shore, slowly dying, and they waited. They waited for the end. The only ones still on their feet were Miller and Davis, but their strength was failing too. Davis was nearly blind, his eyes swollen into narrow slits from which a caustic fluid constantly oozed. He moved through the bunker by touch, leaning against the wall, but he continued to maintain order, doling out the last drops of water and encouraging the men with a quiet, hoarse whisper. Miller, meanwhile, was fighting his last, desperate battle. He understood that it was impossible to save them now. The poison had done its work, but he couldn't just sit and wait. He lanced the largest blisters to relieve the pain, and cleaned the sores with the last of the clean rags, dampened with precious water. These were the actions of a doctor fulfilling his duty to the very end, even knowing the patient is doomed. He was suffering himself. His hands were covered in blisters, his throat was on fire, and a cold, heavy weight sat in his chest. He knew he didn't have much time left, and it was at this moment, at the very bottom of despair, when it seemed all was lost, that a crazy suicidal idea was born in his mind. He sat with his back against the cold wall, staring at the door. The same steel door that had locked them in. They had long given up hope in it. They had accepted it as the lid of their coffin, but Miller saw it differently. What if he tried to open it? Not to escape. He knew they didn't have the strength for that, but to let the world know they were here, so someone would find them. Maybe not alive, but at least they would be found, so their story wouldn't vanish without a trace inside this concrete box. And there was another, more important reason. He had to warn the others. If a cargo like this was on one ship, it could be on others. This hell could be repeated somewhere else. Someone had to tell the truth about the invisible enemy. He picked up the piece of rebar one of the mutineers had dropped. It was heavy, and his hands could barely hold it. He went to Davis. "Sergeant," he whispered, "I'm going to try to open the door." Davis turned his swollen, unrecognizable face toward him. "Why, son?" he rasped. "There's nothing out there but death." "There's air out there, Sergeant. It might kill me. The sudden pressure change, the fresh oxygen. My lungs might not take it. But if I can just get it open a crack, maybe someone will see us. It's our only chance." Davis was silent for a long time. Then he gave a slow nod. "Do what you have to, Doc." It was his blessing. Miller went to the door. He knew it was most likely blocked by a pile of concrete slabs and twisted metal, but the explosion could have also cleared a path. He didn't know. He could only try. He wedged the end of the rebar into the gap between the door and the frame and threw his weakened body's full weight against it. The metal groaned. Nothing. He tried again. And again. Each effort sent an excruciating pain through his chest, and dark spots swam before his eyes. The soldiers, those who were still conscious, watched him in silence. A spark of interest flickered for a moment in their dull eyes. This hopeless struggle of one man against a piece of iron was the last spectacle of their lives. He fought with that door for an hour, or maybe an eternity. Time had lost all meaning, and then just as his strength gave out completely, as he was about to collapse and never get up again, he felt the door give. Just a little. A millimeter. Inspired, he gathered his last reserves of strength and pushed again. With a deafening screech, the door shifted a few centimeters, and through the gap that formed flooded light. A dim, gray daylight, and fresh, salty sea air. For men who had spent 3 days in pitch-black darkness and a poisoned atmosphere, it was like a miracle. Someone let out a faint, ecstatic moan. Miller greedily gulped the fresh air, and immediately doubled over in a terrible coughing fit. His lungs, accustomed to the toxic fumes, reacted to the pure oxygen as if it were a burn. He fell to his knees, choking. He had done his duty. He had punched a window into their prison. But the price of this victory may have been his own life. He lay on the floor, his consciousness slowly fading to the sound of the sea, which now drifted in from outside. The fresh air seeping through the crack was both their salvation and their curse. It brought hope, but it also intensified their agony. The contrast between the clean, salty smell of the sea and the charnel house stench inside the bunker was unbearable. Several men, after taking a deep breath, began to cough as horribly as Miller had. Their ulcerated lungs were not ready for such a shock. But the crack in the door had done its job. They were found. It was a patrol of British sappers clearing rubble in the port. One of them happened to notice a thin sliver of light coming from beneath a pile of debris at the base of the mole. They hadn't heard any shouts. Those inside no longer had the strength to scream. But they heard a quiet, intermittent moan. 2 hours later, a heavy crane had pulled the concrete blocks aside, and rescuers were able to fully open the door. What they saw inside made even hardened veterans recoil. In the dim light on the floor, amidst their own filth, lay bodies. Some were dead, others moaned softly, hovering on the line between life and death. The air inside was so toxic that the rescuers, who had no protective gear, could only stay inside for a few seconds at a time. They pulled the men out, one by one. Of the 12 men who had taken shelter in the bunker, only 4 were alive. Sergeant Davis, Corporal Rossi, one other private, and Leo Miller himself. They were all unconscious, their bodies a mass of open wounds. There was no euphoria of rescue, only a collision with the vast, indifferent world. They were taken not to a standard field hospital, but to a separate, heavily guarded wing of a British military hospital. Here they were treated not by regular doctors, but by chemical weapons specialists urgently summoned from Allied headquarters. The first interrogations began as soon as the survivors could speak. They were conducted by men in clean uniforms with cold, impassive faces. They asked the same questions over and over. What did you see? What did you feel? What was the smell? Miller, his swollen tongue barely able to form words, detailed his theory about the mustard gas, the ship's explosion, the symptoms. The officers listened intently, writing everything down, but there was no sympathy or surprise in their eyes, only a cold, professional assessment. A few days later, when they were feeling slightly better, they were visited by a high-ranking American officer. He didn't ask them about what had happened. Instead, he read them an official order. It stated that due to extraordinary circumstances and in the interests of national security, all information regarding the incident at the port of Bari on December 2nd was now a state secret. They were strictly forbidden from discussing the event with anyone, other soldiers, doctors, or their families in letters. They were not to mention any gas or any strange smell. The official story was that their unit had suffered casualties from a direct enemy bomb hit. The dead were officially listed as victims of enemy action. They, the survivors, had witnessed a terrible tragedy. They had been through hell. Their comrades had died in agony. And now, they were being told that none of it had happened. Their heroism, their suffering, their truth. It was all being erased, nullified by the stroke of a pen by the soulless war machine. They realized that surviving the bunker was only the first circle of hell. The second circle was beginning now. It was the hell of oblivion. At the end of the conversation, the officer placed a piece of paper and a pen in front of each of them. It was a non-disclosure agreement. In dry, legalistic language, it listed the punishments they would face for violating the order, from a court-martial to charges of high treason. "Sign it," the officer said quietly, but with authority. And they signed. Their brotherhood, forged in a concrete crypt, was destroyed. Their ordeal, paid for with blood and pain, was buried alive in classified archives. They had survived, but their truth had been killed. The fates of the few who made it out of Bunker Number 7 alive were varied, but each was indelibly stained by that December tragedy. They returned to a world that did not want to know their truth, and this world broke them. Sergeant Michael Davis, after extensive treatment in hospitals in England and the United States, was medically discharged. The official diagnosis was chronic bronchitis, developed as a result of hypothermia and inhalation of combustion products. He returned to his small hometown in Pennsylvania, but could never readjust to civilian life. He was a quiet, withdrawn man, tormented by nightmares and a brutal, incessant cough. He never told anyone, not even his wife, what really happened in Bari. He took his secret to the grave, dying of lung cancer in 1956. He was only 48 years old. Corporal Vincent Rossi survived, but his mind was permanently damaged. After the hospital, he was committed to a psychiatric facility with a diagnosis of post-traumatic stress disorder. He spoke constantly of some gas, of a conspiracy among the doctors, accusing everyone around him of trying to poison him. He was considered insane, just another victim of the horrors of war. His medical records were classified, along with everything else related to Bari. He spent the rest of his days in various institutions, never returning to a normal life. His rebellion in the bunker continued to the very end, becoming a quiet, lonely war against the shadows in his own mind. The fate of the fourth survivor, a private named Carlson, was lost in the post-war confusion. According to some records, he returned to the front but soon went missing in action during the fighting at Monte Cassino. His short, unremarkable life was cut off as suddenly as his terrible story began. And Leo Miller, the young medic whose intelligence and courage had saved those who could still be saved, survived. His health was permanently ruined. Lung and skin problems plagued him for the rest of his life. After the war, against all odds, he fulfilled his dream. He became a doctor. He worked as a general practitioner in a small town in Wisconsin. He was a good, compassionate physician who was especially attentive to patients with respiratory illnesses. His colleagues and patients respected him, but no one knew the secret he carried in his heart. Bound by his oath and the non-disclosure agreement, he never spoke of Bari. But every night he had the same dream. A dark concrete bunker, the smell of garlic, and the face of Billy Jenkins whispering, "Why didn't you save us, Doc?" He lived a long but quiet and sad life, full of physical pain and mental anguish. He passed away in the early 2000s, the last witness to that forgotten tragedy. He was buried in a local cemetery under a modest headstone. But, as the locals later told, for many years after his death, someone, every winter, in early December, would leave not flowers on his grave, but a small bundle of garlic. Who did it, and why, remains a mystery. The official history of the Second World War is a history of great battles, brilliant commanders, and global political decisions. In this history, there is no room for the tragedy of 12 American soldiers in an unnamed concrete bunker in the port of Bari. Their case was written off, classified, and buried under the stamp, Top Secret. To the Great War Machine, their lives and their torment were merely an inconvenient statistical anomaly, collateral damage in the grand struggle for the future of the EE world. The Allied command did everything to hide the truth. The fact that American chemical weapons were present in Italy could have caused a massive international scandal and given Nazi propaganda a powerful weapon. Therefore, the tragedy in Bari, which some historians would later call the European Pearl Harbor, was to be forgotten as quickly as possible. Reports were falsified, witnesses were silenced, and the cause of death for hundreds of military personnel and civilians was attributed solely to the Luftwaffe bombing. The truth, that most of them died not from enemy bombs, but from Allied mustard gas, was securely hidden for decades. But you cannot kill history. You can hide it, distort it, forbid it, but it will eventually push through, like grass through asphalt. The story of the tragedy in Bunker No. 7 was not preserved in official archives. It transformed into a legend, a soldier's tale, whispered by veterans of the Italian campaign in bars after their third pint of beer. They said there was a cursed place in the port of Bari, an old German pillbox from which, at night, you could still hear a faint cough and the smell of garlic. There was a belief among merchant sailors that the souls of the soldiers who died there had never found peace, and still wandered the piers, searching for fresh air. The story, erased from the official chronicles, found refuge in folklore, in oral tradition, in the trench truths that are often more honest and accurate than the polished reports of staff officers. This story is not just a chronicle of a forgotten war crime or a tragic accident. It is a reminder that war always has two faces. One is for parades with marches and fireworks. The other is secret, dirty, and inconvenient, made up of nameless bunkers like this one, classified tragedies, and broken lives. It is a story of how, in inhuman conditions, in pitch-black darkness and poisoned air, a few ordinary young men fought to the very end, not just for their lives, but for their humanity. Of how a young medic, armed only with knowledge from a textbook, went into battle against an invisible enemy. Of how a sergeant, with his iron will, held a small world together and kept it from falling apart. Their feat was not marked with medals. Their names are not carved on memorial plaques. But their quiet, desperate struggle inside a concrete crypt is as much a symbol of the indomitable human spirit as any great battle recorded in the history books. And as long as we remember stories like this, their sacrifice was not in vain.